If there's one thing you should know about Unitarian Universalists, it's that we like to tell jokes, and the people we like to tell jokes the most about are ourselves. And a pretty popular one, if you go to a UU congregation, you may hear it, you may have already heard it if you've been, is that you may notice during hymns, and I'm not going to sing hymns, you're welcome, but during the hymns, you may notice some of the congregation is right on the beat, and some of the congregation is about a half beat or so behind. And the reason for that is those ones are reading ahead to the next line in the hymnal to make sure they agree with the words they're about to sing. And that's a joke, kind of, because every time I tell that joke from the pulpit, I get people that come up afterward and they say, "Oh, hey, great, great service, and but about that joke, I actually do that. And here are some useful words you could use. Maybe you don't want to sing God. You could replace that with spirit. Maybe you don't want to sing brothers and sisters, and you can replace that with siblings and cousins." So it's kind of a joke. Now there's another joke that's not as popular, but it goes back almost 100 years and a few hundred miles from where I'm at right now. We're going to rewind back to the 1930s in Kansas City, Missouri. Not Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri. And 1930s, it's the Great Depression. We have the Dust Bowl is a big problem. Droughts all over the place, especially the Midwest. And into this scene steps a big meeting of all the clergy in Kansas City. They all gather together and they're going to do a big prayer meeting to ask God for rain to end this drought. And a sort of unexpected visitor shows up, the Reverend Leon Birkhead. Now, he'd been invited. He's a reverend, he's part of the clergy, but he was the preacher over at All Souls Unitarian in Kansas City. And he had a nickname at the time, the Atheist Minister of All Souls. Now, if you'd asked Leon if he was an atheist, he'd probably say no. But if you asked him if he wasn't an atheist, he'd also probably say no. So he shows up, and he has a bit of a reputation for kind of being showy and making a scene. So people were a little cautious, but he gets out of his car, brings his umbrella along, joins the circle. Everyone says their prayers, they make a big thing about it, there's parishioners, the media is there, it's a big deal, right? And prayer meeting goes off without a hitch. Unfortunately, no rain. And everybody starts clearing out. And Birkhead is stopped on the way back to his car by a member of the press. And the guy asks him, he says, "Leon, like, why'd you bring your umbrella? It's the middle of a drought. Nobody else brought an umbrella today." And I think this is what Leon was going for when he brought his umbrella, because his reply was, "Then I take it I'm the only member of the clergy here who has any faith." Welcome to Unitarian Universalist History 101. I'll be your teacher, Mr. Traskazar. And I'd like to tell you today the story of Reverend Leon Birkhead. So Leon Birkhead was born on a small farm in Missouri in 1885. He worked his way through what education he could get. One of his first jobs was as a shoe salesman, and he learned a lot about advertising and bringing people into the store that he kind of carried with him the rest of his career. And he eventually decided to go for the seminary. Now, he doesn't ever get an advanced degree, but you didn't need that in a large part of America to be a preacher. And he lands a job at a Methodist church. And he ends up being an incredibly effective but very, very liberal Methodist minister, even for the time period. Now, this is early 1910s, so we're talking before World War I. He's inviting the IWW, International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and other union members into church, and that was not done in the Midwest at this time, not for anywhere. They were not welcome in most churches at the time because of their radical stances. And he also invited some folks that ended up founding the ACLU. They were invited in and welcomed in his church. And He also marries his wife around this time, Agnes Schirach. She is an incredibly smart woman. He's attracted to her intelligence. She's attracted to his. This is probably one of the best decisions he makes in his life because she's just fantastic. And he had, he goes with the Methodists for a few years, and he's thinking about leaving, and his friends convince him to stay, liberalize the church from within, but eventually it's just too much, and he leaves the church, and Agnes leaves the church separately because she's not just following him, she has her own reasons. But when he's asked by a local newspaper, why did you leave the Methodist Church? He responds with, I do not care a snap of the finger about keeping men out of hell and getting them into heaven, but I do care tremendously about making this earth more like heaven and less like hell. It's not long after that Leon Birkhead gets snapped up by the Unitarians. He gets hired at First Unitarian of Wichita, and he stays there for a couple of years. He really starts bringing people into the pews. He's got an electrified audience every Sunday morning. He's advertising the services, which is new, and he makes enough. He brings in enough money that they're able to pay off their mortgage like years early. And all of those factors really get the attention of Unitarians in the area. And he gets a call from a much bigger church, the All Souls Church, Unitarian Church of Kansas City. And he takes the job. If you paid attention earlier to the joke, then you already knew that. But so he takes the job. And he brings his Sunday morning services. He brings the open forum, which is still going on at All Souls Kansas City Sunday mornings. You can't go there this Sunday morning because, but hopefully in the next year or so, you could go there in person. But you could, log onto their virtual service this Sunday. I'm sure they've got a virtual open forum still going. So when did he start? Early, mid 1930s, I think, till 2020. That's a pretty solid run. So he's minister of All Souls Kansas City the majority of his ministerial career. And we're going to come back to that. But first, we need to talk about the Friends of Democracy. So the Friends of Democracy is Leon Birkhead's sort of biggest legacy. And it started in the early 1930s. Him and his wife were hearing some pretty crazy rumors coming out of Europe, specifically Germany. And they decided to go investigate for themselves. This is before the war started. Nobody's shooting at each other yet. But there's a political party, the Nazis, taking power in Germany, and they've got some pretty wild rhetoric for as liberal a minister as Birkhead is. And so they travel to Germany and they stay in a couple of cities, and they don't see a ton of direct evidence, but they do see enough that they want to keep their eyes on it. So they head back home, and they plan a return trip where they're going to really get into this. And the return trip happens in 1935. And they pose as members of, the American elite. He's a minister, he's well respected, he's published in various papers. And he talks his way, him and his wife talk their way into Julius Streicher's office. Now, Streicher was a big, big propagandist in Nazi Germany. And they have a brief meeting with him, but before the meeting, they're talking with his secretary. And the secretary lets slip something about their American friends. And Birkhead seizes on this. And him and his wife keep this guy talking and say, what kind of people are you talking? Who are you talking? Maybe we know them. Maybe we can go back to America and hook up with them, link up with them. And he just starts spouting out names and names and names of people that the Nazi party is very sympathetic to in America, and that those people in America are very sympathetic to the Nazi cause. So as soon as they can, the Birkheads got out of Germany, they got back to Kansas, and they started figuring out how they could best publicize this list of American Nazi sympathizers. So they put their plans into practice. They, anonymously publicize some things, but then they decide they really need to put their names on it. 1937, the Friends of Democracy are formed. And the entire goal of this organization is to expose Nazi sympathizers in the US. They published magazines, they published pamphlets. One of their most famous was a pamphlet titled What's Wrong with Winrod? And it was targeting a Senate candidate who was pretty openly anti-Semitic, very openly anti-Catholic, would be a very pro-KKK kind of candidate back then. And they put out a pamphlet that just laid out his connections to Nazi Germany. And he lost the Senate race. He was projected to win, or at least it was going to be a very close race, and he just gets demolished. So they definitely stopped one pro-Nazi senator from before we declare war, and maybe more. They put out pamphlets about Henry Ford. They put out pamphlets about Father Coughlin, Gerald L.K. Smith, Fritz Kuhn, the leader of the, if you saw that really good documentary about the Night at the Garden, the big Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, he was the guy that put that together. And so they're getting a lot of followers. They're making a lot of money by publishing these. They're able to hire on a lot of people. They're able to publish a lot of other people's stories about pro-Nazi Americans, trying to get their names out there. And an employee, I like this quote, an employee of the Friends of Democracy described Birkhead once to a member of the press as someone who looks like Franklin, talks like Paine, and fights like Washington. Which is not a bad thing for someone to say about you, really. And to be completely, fair as a historian, not everybody that they published papers on were actual Nazi sympathizers. Some of them just didn't want a war, like the America First organization at the time. Some of them, weren't a big fan of England and France. They weren't really pro-Germany. But there's a saying in Germany these days that if you have 10 people at a table and they're having a nice, respectful conversation and dinner with a Nazi, then you have 11 Nazis at that table. So the thing about Nazism and fascism is that they have to be opposed. You can't just ignore them to let them fester and kind of grow in the shadows, because then they eventually grow enough and then they do what Nazis and fascists do. The US, we had to learn that lesson. Europe had to learn that lesson. Even down to the punk scene in the UK and the US in the 70s and 80s. They had to learn that lesson. But I want to fast forward real quick. Let's pop back to the future, 2020, and let's talk about the Sankofa Special Collection. Now, the Special Collection is housed at one of our seminaries, Meadville Lombard in Chicago, and it contains an archive of the stories, the lives, the biographies, the contributions of UUs of color over the years. And a bunch of it's available digitally. I'll put a link in the description. But there's even more of it in paper on site. Now, you can't go to Meadville Lombard right now because, but hopefully in a year or two, when everything's back to normal-ish, you can go check it out for yourself. It has a ton of documents, a ton of stories, and one of the ones I like best is about William Harris Jr. Now, Bill Harris, he was born in 1926, so Birkhead's kind of doing his thing around then. And a quick point of contrast between these two men. Harris doesn't really like to talk about himself. He's does the work, puts in the work. He was, put in a ton of work in rural Pennsylvania as a black man in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s. He worked with a bunch of civil rights organizations over the years. He worked a ton for his church. He was the church president for a while. He helped run a ministerial search team. He was there just about every Sunday. Everybody liked this guy. He was even elected to represent the district that this 11 church district in rural Pennsylvania. and he had to drive, during times when driving alone as a black man, not that it's safe today, but it really wasn't safe to do in a lot of parts of the country in the 1950s and 60s. So he's just this amazing guy, and he did the work that needs to be done for Unitarian Universalist churches to exist today. And without people like him, I don't know where our denomination would be. We need more people like Bill Harris. We need people that are willing to do that quiet, necessary work of Unitarian Universalism. And I don't think I can say it any better than one of his longtime friends, Martha Holmes, when she nominated him for the Unsung UU Award for the Joseph Priestley District back in 1982. Unitarian Universalism was not some convenient religion for Bill. For a number of years, it had enabled him to live his life with commitment. It offered him courage, strength, and peace, and a community of people who loved him. It enabled him to cope with the uncertainty and pain. He demonstrated to the rest of us that ours is a faith that can truly provide meaning. So let's pop back to All Souls, Kansas City, and Reverend Birkhead in the 1930s, 1940s by this point. And he is just doing great as the minister. He's giving these big sermons, he's drawing people into the crowds, these deep, intellectually stimulating conversations at the open forum. But he's not much of a pastoral care kind of minister. He's not much of a spiritual leader. There's a story that around this time, there's an old member of the church. He's on his deathbed, surrounded by his family. And one of the family members, a daughter maybe, asks, should we call Reverend Birkhead to come while one last ministry while you're on your deathbed? And he looks back at them and says, why bother? That's the kind of minister that Reverend Birkhead was. That's how his congregation saw him. Great for intellectually stimulating Sunday mornings. Why bother on the deathbed? And it was around this time that he sort of officially changed the name of All Souls Kansas City to the Liberal Center. It is no longer a church. It is no longer a congregation. It's not even Unitarian in the name. It's just the Liberal Center. And I say officially, unofficially, because there's letterhead with the Liberal Center on it. It was certainly known as that for probably close to a decade, but it's not anywhere in the church's official records that I could find that there was an official name change. So he is bringing in crowds of people to hear these political, intellectual sermons, to have these political, intellectual conversations during the open forum. But there's not a whole lot of spiritual succor going on. And eventually his work at the Friends of Democracy becomes too demanding, and he leaves the church. And he leaves the church in the hands of a friend of his, the Reverend Raymond Bragg. And I've been lucky enough to talk to a few former members of All Souls Church a few years ago. And I asked them, about Birkhead. What do they remember about Birkhead? What do they talk about Birkhead? And not much. He's mentioned a little bit on their website. He's, they kind of remembered, oh yeah, that was a minister. Wasn't he the guy in the Liberal Center? But then, they said, oh, well, but the guy we talk, the minister that everybody remembers, everybody talks about, is Raymond Bragg. And, he stayed there. He did the work. He deserves to be remembered like that at All Souls, Kansas City. So when I talk about history, I like to talk about the human being, not the hero, not the perfect person. George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree on his dad's farm. He owned slaves until the day he died. So did Thomas Jefferson. And similarly, Birkhead had other flaws than just ignoring some of his pastoral duties as a minister. Like many Unitarians of the time, Birkhead was all in on the science of eugenics. And if you're unfamiliar, there's a lot of good videos out there on YouTube about that, but to give you a quick idea, it was a very American idea that we could perfect the human race through breeding programs, like how we breed dogs, but humans, to try and get the imperfections out of our race. And if that sounds like an idea that came from Nazi Germany, it kind of was. It came from the US, and Nazi Germany just pounced on it. They were like, yes, this is exactly it. It's where Hitler got his idea for the master race from. Now, after the war, I couldn't really find any Unitarians that would admit to being pro-eugenics before the war, but Birkhead was, Margaret Sanger was, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was. It was a big thing among Unitarians in the 20s, and Birkhead was one of them. Now, we might be tempted to give him a pass. You know, it's what people thought. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. But I don't think we should give him that pass. I don't think he deserves it. I don't think that any of them do. Especially with Birkhead, one of his favorite writers, one of his favorite historical figures was Thomas Paine. Talked about him all the time, read his books, reread his books. And Thomas Paine was one of our founding fathers. He wrote Common Sense, that pamphlet that roused the common people to support the revolution. Something that's not always taught about Thomas Paine is his abolition work. When he came to America in like 1774, roughly, he was kicked out of England at the time because he kept causing trouble. So he gets kicked out of England, gets sent to America, 1773, 1774, something like that. And by the end of his first year in the country, he is in charge of multiple abolitionist groups. He's started other abolitionist groups basically anywhere he goes because he knows slavery is wrong. He fights for abolitionist causes till the day he dies. And, you know, Birkhead thought eugenics was a good idea. There's a sermon of his where he complains about the birth rates of blacks and other minorities against the birth rate of the white race. And that sermon is titled, "Is the Human Race Degenerating? Is the Supremacy of the White Race Threatened?" The birth rate is declining among the best elements of the population. The mixing and crossing of the races is producing an inferior type. Well, I mean, but on the other hand, he was against the KKK, he was pro-feminist, he was against the anti-Semitism and the anti-Catholic feelings of the time. You know, he had his great, amazing qualities and he had his flaws. In short, he was a human being. After World War II, the Friends of Democracy tried to sort of pivot to other tyrannical forms of government, namely the Soviet Union. But their tepid support for Russia during World War II, when they were our allies fighting against the Nazis, came back to haunt them. Joseph McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and any other proponent of the Red Scare were looking for anyone pro-Soviet, anyone pro-Russia. And the Friends of Democracy were close enough, so they got targeted, and they also got hit with a couple of lawsuits that they lost, slander or libel, whichever one is the written form. And that combined with a sort of falling off of subscriptions for the newsletter really kind of ended it. After a few years of that, they had to get rid of most of their staff until it was just down to Leon and his son. He had divorced Agnes a few years before. And even that wasn't enough to save the Friends of Democracy. It wasn't much longer until they didn't have enough subscriptions to even pay his son a salary. So it was just him alone in a in an office in Manhattan. And that's where they found him one day in 1954, dead of a heart attack, penniless and alone. So why talk about him in 2020? Why bring up that story? I mean, a few reasons. He opposed fascism when not a lot of people were willing to. And he stopped at least one, like, actual pro-Nazi Senate candidate back at the beginning of the Friends of Democracy, Gerald Winrod. And, you know, he learned the lesson that I mentioned the punk culture in the UK and the US had to learn, is that if one Nazi gets through, there's going to be a lot that follow. So we know that he was instrumental in making sure Winrod didn't get elected to the Senate. We did not have a senator, an actual pro-Nazi senator, when we were voting to go fight in World War II. And if he had won 2 years later, how many more pro-Nazi candidates would have had a good chance of getting into the Senate? What would that have done to World War II? What would that have done to history? You know? So it's good to learn these stories, I think. But another thing, and this is something way at the beginning of his career, he might have even still been at the Methodist Church. He was talking about his goals with being a minister and religion in general, and he said that he wanted to humanize and socialize religion. And he didn't live to see the unification of the Unitarian and the Universalist churches in 1961. That happened almost a decade after his death. But he did have an impact. He did have some influence, because if you look at our 7 principles, if you look at the 7 principles that we affirm and promote as Unitarian Universalists, right? I mean, they certainly look like they're more concerned with making this world less like hell and a little more like heaven. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later. So the full list of sources are going to be in the description. I think if I'm going to do some history stuff, I should try and at least be a little academic about it and cite my sources. The main source is this book here, Democracy's Defender, The Life of L.M. Birkhead by Jim Grebe. It's not a very long read. It's fantastic. It hits a bunch of the major things. And I promise, to the best of my knowledge, there is no actual blood relation here. But I also got some good information. Adam Holland, one of his blogs from September of 2009, had some good, interesting things. Harold Raylier, one of his thesis papers from 1971, had some interesting stuff about the Friends of Democracy in it. It's titled Anti-Extremism and Ideology, a study of membership attitudes and characteristics of the Institute for American Democracy, a nonpartisan, non-sectarian, anti-extremist organization. Thesis titles, right? And of course, the Sankofa Special Collection, Special Archive biography of William Harris Jr. So full citations will be in the description. Thanks again.